Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good to be back here after a little break. So we're starting a new series today on mythology and its impact on our psyche. And the intention behind this series was largely, I find it hugely of personal interest in terms of looking at mythology in the context of today and looking at what does it mean, if at all, and how do we also utilize the stories from a perspective of sometimes personal healing but also social healing. And the reason I wanted to specifically pick up this topic during this time is, given the socio-political context today, the elections coming up and what's happening elsewhere around the world, we see a lot of polarization happening, and the polarization seems to be happening in the name of religion, which largely is based on mythology. And there is an opportunity to look at are we interpreting it correctly. So that's the intention behind this series. So what I'm hoping to do over the next few months is to pick up stories, or sometimes even small parts of big stories, and look at how can you and me utilize it and reconnect with it and maybe heal parts of us in some ways, if at all. So if we have to look at how we've connected traditionally with mythology, and mythology could sometimes be epics, like in the Indian context we would talk of a Mahabharata or a Ramayana kind of a thing, or the Greek mythology or the Egyptian mythology. Mythology could sometimes also loosely be interpreted to include folk tales and Aesop's fables and in Panchatantra kind of tales, which don't necessarily have a claim in history, but they are very much a part of our social myth. And also mythology sometimes could include fairy tales or grandmother's tales that we've grown up hearing. Now, traditionally most myths have been interpreted as having some sort of a claim in history, so that there is some historical fact on which myth seems to be based, is the claim that we tend to hold, and that's the claim that, at least in the current context, seems to be giving rise to a lot of conflict when we look at Ayodhya and those kind of issues. Right? So there is one way of looking at it, which is to look at it as possibly a historical fact, and then to look at, can we actually dig out the facts, because here at this point we were just basing it on an assumption that maybe it was historical. The other way to look at mythology is to look at it as a philosophical truth.
Learning.
Yeah, as learning, and the learning was in some way coded in the form of a story by the authors of those stories, and in most cases there are multiple authors of the same story, and maybe it was their representation of what might be termed as permanent ethics. Right? And yeah, I very clearly distinguish here between permanent ethics and temporary ethics, and a lot of these permanent ethics seems to be coded in the story format, which have sustained over the period of time as ethics. So when I say permanent ethics, ethics that don't really, they are eternal, they don't change over a period of time, like being, the value of being honest, or having integrity is a permanent ethic, and it's probably not changed over the course of millennia. However, there could be the morality piece, which is often attached to ethics, like saying a woman should be dressed in a particular way, which is a temporary ethic, and as culture changes, the ethic changes as well. So here when we talk of mythology, I'm largely referring to the permanent ethic part of it. Another lens through which we can look at it is mythology as a way of coding naturally occurring processes, life processes that exist, and they keep recurring over millennia. So in every society, in every era, there is a possibility of the same story being lived out again and again, and those processes being coded in the form of a story. And depending on the era in which that story is coded, the outer context changes. Right? So for example, if you look at, in the Indian context, if you have to distinguish between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Ramayana is coded in an era where the external context is extremely patriarchal and moralistic, and therefore that there are these social codes of behavior which are expected to be adhered to, and Ram as a hero is shown to be very clear about adhering to those codes, right? The codes slightly shifts when you look at the Mahabharata, right? Where the role of Krishna is also widened to accommodate a slightly corrupt, a slightly devious, a slightly political angle into it. Yeah, so there is an element of manipulation which you don't overtly see in the Ramayana. So the external context seems to keep shifting depending on the change of the environment externally. So while the process is still the same in the sense both of these stories still depict the whole thing about good over evil, so the natural process still continues, but the external environment somehow shifts. So when I'm looking at this series, I'm largely looking to reconnect with mythology primarily from that lens, to look at it as the epic or the myth being a story which seems to depict a natural human evolution process with a certain context to it, depending on where the story seemed to have come from. The need for reinterpretation to me personally comes from my work lens largely. So just before we began the talk, we were talking about what I do, and what I do is partly work in the whole idea of conscious capitalism and therefore consulting with corporate organizations in leadership development. The other part of my work is as a conflict resolution specialist, so I work on track to diplomacy projects, largely on the Indo-Pak front. So for me, when I look at both of these contexts, a whole lot of misunderstandings, dysfunctions, conflicts occur because we're viewing it from one lens, right? We're viewing myths, for example, from the historical lens and saying this is what it is, 1947 this happened, right? So we're holding on to that fact and only looking at it from a sociological perspective and saying that, for example, 1947 partition happened, it divided Hindus and Muslims, and then we continue to live with the story, and the story is long ended, but we seem to want to live with it. And therefore for me it's also a personal need to look at, can we of course honor the myth, it's there, but look at it from a more evolutionary and a more nourishing lens of saying how can the story serve me today? I mean, does it have to lead to bloodshed, or can I look at it as a symbolic thing? I mean, can I look at it from a psychological lens and say maybe the story is still useful, right? But I need to learn to reconnect with it. Right? So yeah, if there were to be a theme to this series, it's about looking at how do I make stories nourishing for me here and now. So why are we looking at reinterpretation? Well, to summarize what I spoke about so far, as humanity, of course, we continue to evolve. We seem to evolve in a biological sense. We seem to evolve in terms of consciousness, in terms of how we socially interact and function. And therefore, as we evolve, the archetypes that we hold in our stories also evolve, right? So for example, every story typically has an idea of a hero or a heroine who's like the central character, or that there's a villainous character, for example. And these archetypes also evolve over a period of time. So if you look at the archetype of the good guy in times of Ramayana, it was this guy who was absolutely moral, obeyed every rule, stuck to every demand made by society, and that was the archetype, the perfect figure of the hero. And that hero seemed to shift when it became Krishna, and it was the time of the Mahabharata where the hero also had to be street smart, the hero also had to be to a degree manipulative, politically savvy, good at dialogue in a way that he's able to manage the external circumstance, and therefore now this hero was not somebody who followed everything by the book. So the archetype had shifted. Right? Now if you look at the evolving archetype, and if you look at modern movies, for example, there is a certain comfort with things being grey. Things are not necessarily black or white, but the heroes also have their faults, they have their bad days, and It's about making it more real for everybody. So since the archetypes evolve, it also becomes important to reconnect with older stories which still seem to lay our social foundation, and look at how do we reconnect the story back to reality. How do we make it relevant and useful and safe in the context of today, and hence the need for reinterpretation. So I intend to take up one or two stories in every session in this series. Today I'm taking up only this particular one. And I'm not even taking up an entire story, I'm just taking up this one specific instance of the battle of Mahabharata beginning, and it's the time where the Pandava and the Kaurava army both have assembled, and before the battle begins, Arjuna is in the state of dilemma. He does not want to fight. Right? And because Arjuna is in a state of dilemma, and of course the warriors have gathered, there's a huge story behind that, and there's no way the war cannot happen. The war has to happen regardless of whether he wants to fight or not. But because he's in that story seems to somehow hold the energy of the central warrior, he takes that on, and the first thing he does when everyone has assembled is he requests his charioteer, Krishna, to say, take me to the center of the battlefield. Right? I want to see who I'm going to battle, who I'm perhaps going to kill. And he goes to the center of the battlefield. At some point he gets off and he looks at the so-called enemy and he says, this is family, I can't possibly be killing them. Right? And then there is that dialogue that ensues and the Gita that flows through Krishna. But what I'd like for us to look at in this story is one, like we say, if you look at it as just a story, look at it from the historical lens, then it's an incident where a certain warrior and a certain charioteer went out, looked at people, discussed something, came back. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is look at the symbols in this particular moment in the story. So you have these opposing factions on two sides of the battlefield. And interestingly, in the Mahabharata, what they are fighting for is Hastinapur. Right? And if you look, even if you look at the term Hastinapur, Hastin, the Sanskrit term Hastin, elephant, right? Elephant as a symbol of wisdom, one with the large brain and the large ears, which is typically a symbol of being an extremely wise being. And they are fighting for this city of wisdom. They're in a way fighting for the wisdom in their own lives. They're striving for that, and there's a battle of forces, perhaps internally within an individual, which is depicted through these millions of characters that form part of the epic Mahabharata. So if you look at the symbolism of just this particular scene, you've got these two forces on the battlefield. There's Arjuna, the warrior figure, at the center of it. Right? The chariot is a chariot with 4 horses. That's Arjuna's chariot. The charioteer is Krishna, the god figure. And interestingly, Arjuna's chariot, so each of those chariots have a flag. Arjuna's flag is this red flag, and it has the symbol of Hanuman. Right? Hanuman, and if you look at the traditional depiction of Hanuman, he's typically shown as this monkey god with a heart, the heart open to Ram, Sita and Lakshman. Right? So you have Ram and Sita as a couple, and then Lakshman at their feet. Right? That's typically the symbolism around this whole piece. And just that scene for me is a huge resource in terms of how do we connect with the whole battle, the idea of battle and the battle for wisdom, the battle for Hastinapur. So if you have to broadly look at the elements of this particular scene and this particular myth, there are these two characters. There's Krishna and Arjuna, which is, we're talking of Arjuna being this normal human warrior character. And there is Krishna, which is the god-like character, right? So the divine and the human, and the divide between the two. And the fact that the divine is the charioteer of the human, the divine in a way drives the human around. Right? So, and when we say divine, we can interpret it in the form of a soul, you can interpret it as the idea of God, whatever that means to us, or just higher consciousness, a higher elevated sense of awareness, right, which seems to drive the charioteer as he goes into battle. And then you have these other symbols. There are these 4 horses. There is the whole chariot itself, the vehicle through which the movement happens. And there's that flag with Hanuman. Now, if the framework that in this case I choose to interpret the story with is the septenary lens. This was the first I've heard it proposed was with Helena Blavatsky, the Theosophical Society, right? And she had spoken about how the human structure, the human, the soma, which is the body, and the psyche put together, right? It can be divided into these 4 levels. So each of us have 7 levels of being, right? The first 4, the bottom 4 that you see here are what are called as rupa, which is the form, right, which means there's a physical tangibility about the rupa. And then there is the top 3, which are the arupa, that is a formless. Right? So there is the manifest and there is the unmanifest part of self. So if we have to look at elements of the rupa, the 4 layers of the rupa, the first layer is what is called as the sthula sharira. So another term for rupa is the sharira, the vehicle, right? And the sthula sharira is gross matter, physical body, flesh and blood, which gives tangibility. Yeah, right? So that's gross matter. It is what we seem to most identify with in our day-to-day scheme of things, right? So that's the sthula. Then you have what is called the linga sharira. The linga is, one way of interpreting it is the astral body, but the linga is also our emotional force, the force that helps us feel life. It makes us feel pleasure and displeasure and happiness and sadness and all of that. And in a way it also, and it makes us who we are as a social being. If we were to not have the linga, if we were to not have the emotional drive, we would probably not connect with life as we know it, right? So there is the sthula, there is the linga, there is the prana sharira, which is the breath force, the life force that we hold, right? And so the prana is what in a way animates the sthula and the linga, the fact that I have a body and I have emotion and I'm breathing, right? So the physical representation of pranas is the breath, but prana of course is life force in all its glory, which is perhaps a little difficult to explain, but all of us experience it as we live. And there is the mental body, which is what is called as the kama rupa or the kama manas. Kama being the term for desire, right? Desire from a very subjective sense, my desire, my pleasure, what I think is right, right? So the rupa contains all of this. So it has my physical body, it has my mental body, it has my emotional body, it has the life force that animates all of this, right? And yet when we talk of manas from the human perspective, we're talking about manas which is very subjective reality, and therefore my reality is always different from your reality, right? Because I'm looking at life from my lens and what is good for me, what is right for me, what I want, which may sometimes be in conflict with what you want. Right? So these 4 elements put together in a psychological sense form what is called the personality, right, or the persona. Right? And then there is sometimes a connect and sometimes a slight disconnect with the arupa, the formless part of us, which begins with the 5th layer, which is manas. Now here Manas as distinguished from Kama Manas, in the sense Manas is objective reality. Here we are talking about intelligence, but intelligence which is collective intelligence, which is guiding all of us put together, right? And it's not about my or yours, but it is what it is. It's objective. The next level of it is buddhi. Buddhi is a very loose term, would be wisdom, but it's also a sense of being enlightened. Right?
Intellect.
Not just intellect, but enlightenment. So if we were to put well, most of us live in this space, right? So it's difficult to put a name to that, but it's perhaps, buddhi was perhaps what Buddha was striving for, right? In terms of saying, can I be free of the rupa? Can I be free of the suffering of the rupa, and then look at what else lies beyond it? So that sense of connection with everything and everyone around, form and the formless and the human and the non-human and all of it put together, and a space that holds it all. And then the ultimate reality of the Atma, which is the soul. That soul is again one really small word to express it, but that's, yeah, words don't quite do justice to the top three pieces. Now, if you were to look back at this scene and look at it through the lens of the septenary framework, so you have this symbolism that there is the personality, there is this Arjuna who's this very human form, right, who's a warrior, which is what a lot of us do in our day-to-day lives. We're fighting for what we're striving for our livelihood, we're fighting for our families, all of that, right? And warrior not in a battlefield sense of it, but just fighting for life, right? And there is the arupa in the form of Krishna, so the formless, that the divinity that seems to be personified as the idea of the Krishna. And if we were to look at the four horses, the four horses as representations of these four levels of the personality, the gross body, the mental, the emotional body, the mental body, the life force, and left to themselves, these four horses, if they are not reined in, they'll probably go their own way, they'll have their own sense of direction, and they may not necessarily have a purpose, which is pretty much a representation of saying, if I were to let my body do its thing, the body might want to sleep all day, eat all day, do whatever for its own pleasure or comfort, without necessarily connecting with what is real and what is its purpose. Similarly, if I were to let my linga sharira drive me, if I let my emotions drive me, again, I'm going to be completely imbalanced, because my emotions might drive me to be extremely selfish and insensitive about everybody else, right? Or I might be extremely sentimental and not be real and authentic, right? So similarly, even if I were to give way to my intellect and to my mental body and look at life only from that perspective, then there is a possibility that I'm intellectualizing everything and knowing about life, but not necessarily knowing life, right? In the sense, I'm not engaging, but I'm just observing, and that's not real either. So the representation, it seems to be very rich in the symbolism of saying that these four horses which have life force, each of them have strength, and yet they need to be all reined in by that divine form, so that it has a sense of direction, so that it fights the good fight, so that it doesn't go all over the place, right? So the chariot with the four horses seems to be representation of the persona that needs to be reined in and given a sense of direction, not controlled, but given a purpose, right? And then what is this chariot with the four horses guided by? The flag, the motto of the battle seems to be of this figure of Hanuman, right? Now Hanuman in various mythologies is represented in different ways. You look at Hanuman is also another way of interpreting Hanuman. If you look at the Christian myth, is Archangel Michael. In the Zoroastrian myth, there's Behram Yazid, all of which represent the same archetype of Hanuman. Hanuman as an archetype is someone who's in service, and very purposefully in service, very unquestionably in service of what he deems is divine. Right? And there is the idea of the Trinity. So there is the masculine and the feminine, so there is Ram and Sita in the case of Hanuman, and there is Lakshman who willingly chooses to attach himself to the divine, to say, no matter what the cost is, I'm here to serve this consort of divinity. Right? And he does it at a cost. He does it at a cost where he leaves his own wife for no reason. He gives up the throne, which could have been his, and all of that. Right? And that's while there is a price to pay, his choice and his commitment is to say, I'm attaching myself to what I believe is right, what I believe is the eternal truth. Right? And Hanuman chooses to serve all of that. Right? So if you look at the symbolism of that one scene in Mahabharata, it's about this divine trying to hold together these 4 horses with the motto, with the flag, which says that there is a commitment to fighting for that divinity, for the union of the masculine and the feminine forces, which again can be interpreted in multiple ways as Purusha and Prakriti, or Theos and Chaos, right? Or the masculine and the feminine principle coming together. And the human choosing, eventually after the Gita happens, the human Arjuna in this case, choosing to say, okay, I'll come back to the chariot, I'll go back to my side and fight the good fight. After having understood that what I'm trying to do as Arjuna is to rein in my personality, to acknowledge that there are these 4 horses, they are pulling me in 4 different directions. I recognize that there is family that I need to kill. Right? I recognize that there is something else that I'm trying to protect while I'm trying to kill the Kauravas. Right? So he's managing all of these 4 horses, and in the process of managing it, what he is committed to is to serve divinity, to serve what is the higher cause. In this case is Hastinapur again, wisdom, the buddhi that they're trying to seek through the root of the manas. The manas in this case is held by Krishna. Right? So, and manas is held by Krishna in the sense Krishna is trying to very much be engaged with reality, but he is also very objectively engaged, in the sense that when Duryodhan comes in and asks him, I want your army, he does give him that army. Right? So there is engagement, but there is engagement in an objective way, in a way that it says, I'm there for everybody, I'm not partial. Right? But it's about how you choose to engage with me. So there's that very clear distinction between manas and kama manas there, where Arjuna's manas says, no, it's wrong, this is family, I can't kill. But Krishna as an objective manas, as the objective holder of reality, says, hey, no one's dying, no one's living, right? It's a cycle anyway. You've got to fight because what you're fighting for is your own buddhi. So, and of course we can keep going deeper and deeper into this, but I like to hold it at this space here. So yeah, the invitation for today is to maybe at some point in time later in the day reconnect with that particular scene and look at what's your Mahabharata, what's your fight in terms of your body, your emotion, your relationships, your mental, intellectual reality. Who is the Kaurava, and what is that flag on top? What is it that you're serving as you fight what you fight? Right. So yeah, mythology always leads us to questions more than answers, but the idea is to utilize it in a manner that the questions are useful and they're not only historical and factual, which lead us to fighting an external fight. So yeah, one way to reinterpret this particular scene is to look at what's our battle, what are those four forces in me, how do I manage them? Do I give precedence to one more than the other? Do I give my body more comfort than my mind? Do I intellectualize everything at the cost of other forces? Right? How do you connect with those 7 principles, the 7 levels of our own being? And therefore, what is your Gita? What is your song? Is there hesitation to fight? Are there certain fights you don't want to fight because you think it's family in whatever sense of the term? Right? Is there a hesitation to say, I don't want to engage at all in battle, let me just step away and be aside? Right? Or do I go do my dharma being my role, whatever is it that I seem to be in this place and time for in life, and engage, and therefore also start looking at life as a game. It doesn't have to be a war, right? It's a game, and the stronger side wins, but which is the side that wins? Right? And therefore, how do I incorporate that myth and that reinterpretation in my daily reality? And my daily reality could sometimes be a battle between, let's say, my stula sharira, my gross body, and my emotion. And my emotion says, I want to eat chocolate, and my stula says, no, that's not good for me. And how do I fight that fight? Yeah. And it's a battle that we fight every day, but it's about looking at not giving the power of the story away by relegating it to history, but to say the story lives here and now, and how do I work with it in a conscious manner. Right. So I'm going to leave you with questions more than answers for today, and we'll explore more stories as we go along in the series. All right then.
Even if you see the Mahabharata, though the Gita and all this thing we hear, and ultimately it's an emotional attachment, but if you really see the names of the Kaurava, like Duryodhana, Dushasana, and so these are all names given
to a certain attribute.
Attributes, and ultimately this was not the actual fight.
Not like a physical.
Just to form that, and after over a period of time, years, people should understand this is the fight between your own self,
your own self.
good and bad.
Yeah.
But now we interpret that it has really happened.
Yeah. But it's also the fact that we choose to interpret it as a fact is also a systemic way of giving our power away, right? To say that I'll conveniently interpret it as a story so that the system does the fight for me, I don't have to fight for myself, right? So it's also about reinterpreting myths. For me, is also about reclaiming that power back and say, hey, the fight is in me, it can't be the system doing the fight for me. So yeah, it's also in a way time to reclaim power back from history. All right, then let's wrap it here for today. Thank you.